You spent years thinking you were improving, that therapy, books, and nights of introspection were making you a kinder person, easier to be around, more acceptable. And then one day someone you love looked at you and said, "You've changed. You've become cold." And you felt that punch to the gut, that corrosive doubt. Have I become arrogant? Carl Jung would have looked at this scene with an almost clinical calm and said something no one wants to hear. You haven't become arrogant. You've become truthful. And to most people around you, truth and arrogance are the same thing because they have never had to differentiate between the two. This isn't about ego. It's about perception. And perception, when it truly changes, doesn't ask for permission to disturb those who are still asleep. Genuine psychological healing was never about feeling good all the time. That is the self-help version sold to those who are afraid of the real process. True healing doesn't soften life. It reorganizes the way you see it. It's as if, for years, you had been watching a movie with the volume turned down, catching only half the dialogue, missing nuances, thinking it was normal not to understand why certain scenes made you uneasy. And suddenly, someone turns the volume up. You start to hear everything. The subtext that once went unnoticed now screams. The patterns you repeated without realizing, the automatic behaviors you called just my way, the emotional dynamics that sustained entire relationships without anyone ever having spoken the truth out loud. All of this begins to appear with almost unbearable clarity. And here is the first misconception that needs to die right now. You thought healing meant becoming more tolerant of everything, more patient, more understanding, more willing to yield. But healing doesn't work like that. It doesn't make you more tolerant of others' chaos. It makes you incapable of continuing to pretend that the chaos doesn't exist. You start to see power games disguised as care. You start to notice when a demand is dressed as concern, when silence is punishment, when a compliment is bait. And the problem isn't that these things started existing in your life. They were always there. The problem is that now you see them, and seeing what was always there, but what you chose or were trained not to see, changes everything, because you cannot unsee it. There is no going back. This is where most people get stuck. They think seeing clearly is a burden, a curse, and they secretly wish to return to the comfortable blindness of before. But Jung would say that this new vision is not a punishment. It is the first real symptom that the psyche is finally functioning as it should. You haven't become paranoid. You have become awake. And no one warned you that waking up hurts more than sleeping. Now observe what happens when this clarity begins to manifest in your behavior. You who used to say yes to everything, who rearranged your schedule to fit into the urgency of others, who swallowed entire opinions to avoid causing discomfort, that person begins to disappear. In their place emerges someone who hesitates before agreeing, someone who asks, "Does this really make sense to me?" before accepting. Someone who starts saying no, and worse, who says no without over-justifying, without apologies embedded in the refusal, without softening the rejection to protect the ego of the other. And it is exactly here that the word arrogance enters the scene, pronounced by those who became accustomed to your unlimited availability, because to those who only knew you as a mirror, you becoming a person feels like an affront. Not because you changed for the worse, but because you ceased to be useful in the way you were before. It isn't about who you have become. It is about the function you stopped fulfilling in the lives of others. Think about this coldly, without pitying anyone, not even yourself. For years, perhaps decades, you functioned as an external emotional regulator for people who, they never learned to regulate themselves. You absorbed their anxiety by saying yes. You avoided their conflict by swallowing your own. You maintained the peace of the environment by sacrificing your truth. And the system, that invisible organism made of unspoken expectations, worked well for everyone but you. When you start to heal, this system loses its silent operator, and systems do not like losing operators. They react. And the most common, most cowardly, and most effective reaction is to label change as a character flaw, to call what is in truth a boundary, coldness, to call what is in truth newly discovered authenticity, selfishness. You did not become impossible to manipulate by accident. You became that way because you stopped providing the raw material that manipulation needs to function, your desperate need to be accepted at any cost. And that, for those who never had to work for your approval, is unbearable. Because now they have to. And no one likes to discover that they needed something that was, in fact, extracted by force and not given out of love. There is a concept that Jung named and that surgically explains why you arrived here carrying guilt for being yourself: the persona. Forget the academic jargon for a moment and look at your own life. The persona is not a conscious lie. It is a mask so well constructed, so necessary for your emotional survival as a child, that you forgot it was a mask. It became your face. Remember that strange exhaustion that hits after a social event, even when you had fun. That fatigue that normal sleep does not resolve. This is not introversion. It is not just being physically tired. It is the raw cost of having performed for hours a version of yourself calibrated to keep others comfortable. You laughed at the right moment. You agreed when you disagreed. You softened a strong opinion so as not to seem difficult. You hid the boredom, disguised the discomfort, fueled a conversation that had already died 20 minutes ago, just so the silence would not be interpreted as rejection. This is work, unpaid, unrecognized emotional labor which you had been doing since childhood without knowing you had a choice. And here lies the part that is hardest to digest. Many of the things you considered your best qualities, your excessive kindness, your constant availability, your ability to never bother anyone, were in fact emotional survival strategies disguised as virtue. You learned very early that being easy guaranteed love, that being light avoided abandonment, that never having needs avoided being considered a burden. This is not character. This is adaptation to an environment where your authentic existence at some point was punished, ignored, or ridiculed, and you learned, with the brutal intelligence of a child trying to survive, to build another version of yourself that was safer to keep alive. Healing does not destroy this persona. It only reveals the price you were paying to maintain it, and once the price is seen, it is impossible to continue paying it without awareness. You might even continue performing at times, by choice, by strategy. But you will never again be able to do so without knowing exactly what you are doing. And this awareness, alone, is already the beginning of freedom, even if it feels at first like the beginning of a collapse. There is a pattern that repeats with an almost mathematical precision in every real process of individuation. The more you know yourself, the more you realize you need help to sustain what is being revealed. Because clarity without structure just becomes observed chaos. Seeing the pattern is not the same as having the tools to change it. And it was exactly with this precise point of the process in mind, the moment when you already see too much to turn back, but do not yet have the map to move forward, that I prepared the Código do Despertar for you. The Código do Despertar is not more a generic motivational course promising instant happiness. It is an inner map built on the psychology of Carl Jung, designed for the 60 days in which your perception changes faster than your emotional structure can absorb. Every day, you receive a lesson with a key, a question, and a statement. You read it, perform a concrete micro-action, and record your reflection in the journal. It is not piled-up theory. It is a daily practice of individuation, the process by which you stop being the mask they built for you, and finally become who you have always been beneath it. If you have come this far feeling that this video is describing your life in uncomfortable detail, comment the word desperto on the pinned comment. That is the first symbolic gesture of commitment to your own transformation. No one will do this for you, but you don't have to do it alone. Let us return to what this newborn clarity demands of you, because the work is far from over at the moment of saying no. It only begins there. After you stop performing the socially safe version of yourself, something deeper emerges, something that Jung called the shadow. And the shadow is not the villain of your story, despite everyone treating it as such. The shadow is simply everything you learned to bury in order to continue being loved. Your anger swallowed in situations where you should have screamed. Your ambition hidden behind false modesty because wanting too much was seen as arrogance before you even understood what arrogance meant. Your boundaries ignored time and again until you gave up even trying to set them. None of that died when you buried it. Things buried do not disappear. They ferment in the dark and eventually leak. They leak as resentment in disproportionate moments. They leak as explosions of anger that seem to come out of nowhere, but in reality come from a very ancient place. They leak as envy disguised as moral criticism toward those who dared to do what you never allowed yourself to do. Confronting the shadow is destroying once and for all the comfortable fantasy that you are a person morally superior to the average. This hurts in a different way than the pain of being rejected by others. This is the pain of being disappointed in yourself, of discovering that your kindness in part was disguised fear, and that your infinite patience in part was cowardice of confrontation dressed as spiritual virtue. Jung did not see this as a reason for shame. He saw it as the only possible path to real integration. You cannot integrate that which you refuse to admit exists within you. And no one becomes whole by hiding half of themselves in the basement of their own mind. Here is the antithesis that sustains this entire stage. You are not becoming worse by admitting your shadow. You are stopping the pretense that you only had light, and pretending that one only has light is not holiness. It is just another, more sophisticated way of lying to yourself. This internal change inevitably collides with the external world, and this is where loneliness hits with full force, because every human relationship, however loving it may seem on the surface, carries within it invisible contracts. No one signs them, no one discusses them openly, but everyone fulfills them. I pretend everything is fine so you don't feel guilty, and you pretend not to notice my sacrifice so I don't feel used. I always yield first, and you never have to learn to yield. I absorb your bad mood without complaining, and you never have to develop your own emotional regulation. These are the true foundations of many bonds you called love, friendship, or family. And most relationships, when you observe them with clinical coldness, are not based on pure love. They are based on these unconscious psychological contracts, negotiated in silence, fulfilled out of fear of abandonment. When you heal, you break these contracts without ever having signed the E. Resignation out loud. You simply stop fulfilling your part, and whoever was on the other side feels the ground give way, because the invisible structure that held the entire relationship together suddenly no longer exists. The natural, almost reflexive reaction is not how wonderful that you are evolving. The reaction is resistance, it is withdrawal, it is the silent or explicit accusation that you have changed for the worse. You will lose people in this process, not because you have become unbearable, but because the only version of you they could tolerate was exactly the one you are ceasing to be. This causes a specific loneliness, different from all others. It is not the loneliness of being physically alone, it is the loneliness of being surrounded by people who love a version of you that no longer exists. And there is no emotional shortcut to get through this phase. There is only the crossing. It is exactly at this breaking point, when old contracts crumble and loneliness settles with an almost physical weight in your chest, that structured work becomes the difference between giving up and returning to the old mask, or continuing to the other side. That is why the Código do Despertar was designed with 60 days of daily guidance, precisely because individuation does not happen in a single epiphany, but in a sustained sequence of small, conscious decisions. Each lesson exists to give you the language for what you are feeling, practical exercises to avoid regressing to the old autopilot, and a journal space so that you can observe with your own eyes the distance between who you were and who is emerging. This journey does not need to be made in the dark. The guide is in the first pinned comment, and if you have already felt firsthand this loneliness of breaking contracts you never chose to sign, leave the word sombra in the comments. It is a small gesture, but it is the kind of symbolic commitment that separates those who just watch the video from those who truly decide to go through the process. The loss does not end with external relationships. It finally reaches the very identity you built over a lifetime of emotional survival. Because many of the roles you played were not just occasional behaviors. They were entire identities built on the need to ensure love and belonging. The savior, who only feels valuable when rescuing someone from a crisis. The peacemaker, who dedicates their entire life to avoiding any conflict around them, even when the conflict was necessary and healthy. The one who never needs anything, who learned that asking for help was synonymous with weakness or guaranteed rejection, and therefore built a self-sufficiency that was, in truth, isolation disguised as strength. When healing advances, these roles begin to crumble one by one, and the void left in their place is not instant freedom. At first, it is a kind of symbolic death, because if you spent your entire life being the savior and suddenly stop saving everyone, who are you? If you were always the peacemaker and now allow conflict to exist without running to put out the fire, who remains when the function disappears? This question is terrifying for those who were never allowed to exist outside of a utility. And that is exactly why so many people retreat at this point, preferring to return to the old role, even knowing the price, because at least there, an identifiable identity existed, however suffocating. But Jung understood this symbolic death not as an end, but as a prerequisite. You cannot discover who you are while you are still busy being who others need you to be. The identity built for survival was always borrowed, shaped by external circumstances, never chosen from within. And abandoning this borrowed identity, however frightening it may seem, is the only path to the real identity. Not because the real one is perfect or has all the answers, ready, but because for the first time it is yours. After this symbolic death occurs, and there is no shortcut to skip this stage, something begins to recompose itself in a different way. The constant anxiety to please begins to lose its force, not because you have stopped caring about people, but because you stop needing their approval to know that you exist. You begin to trust your own perception, even when it contradicts the consensus around you. You stop over-explaining yourself, stop apologizing for the space you have every right to occupy, and stop softening uncomfortable truths just to preserve the comfort of others. This does not mean you become cold or indifferent, as those who are left behind will insist on labeling you. It means you stop confusing love with self-annulment. You continue to care, but now out of choice, not fear. You choose the people you spend time with, not for the function they fulfill in your emotional survival, but for the real quality of the connection, based on mutual respect and awareness, not on dependency disguised as intimacy. And it is curious to notice how the relationships that survive this transformation become deeper, not more distant, because now they no longer need to sustain invisible contracts. They simply exist without demands, without silent obligation, without the weight of roles inherited from childhood. This is the stage most people never reach, because they give up halfway through at the most painful moment, when they are still losing people and do not yet feel firm ground beneath the feet of their new identity. It is exactly in this interval between loss and reconstruction that the daily structure of the Código do Despertar fulfills its most important function, supporting you when the loneliness still hurts, but the old mask is no longer of any use. 60 days, one lesson at a time, so you do not have to rebuild alone in the dark. Something as delicate as your own identity. The first pinned comment is still there, waiting for you, and if any part of this reconstruction phase has already echoed in your experience, write the word Liberdad in the comments now before you continue watching. This simple gesture is the practical beginning of a decision your mind has already made, but which your body still needs to confirm through action. We arrive then at the quietest and most definitive point of this entire process: consciousness as the final result of healing. And here, Jung would make a distinction that completely changes the way you look at all the other human beings around you, including those who hurt you, who labeled you, who resisted your transformation. A large part of human behavior, almost all of it, is born from unconscious fears and unresolved wounds. That person who called you arrogant for saying no for the first time probably never had permission to say no in their own life. The one who walked away when you stopped saving them probably never learned to save themselves, because no one ever demanded that of them. This does not mean you should go back to carrying the weight of these others' patterns. It just means you stop interpreting the resistance of others as proof that you did something wrong. You begin to see with almost painful clarity that most of the anger, judgment, and rejection you received was never really about you. It was about the uncomfortable mirror that your transformation represented to those who have not yet had the courage to begin their own. True psychological evolution, according to this logic, never aimed to make you superior to anyone. That would just be another mask, a more sophisticated version of ego disguised as spirituality. The real goal is much simpler, and at the same time, infinitely more difficult. To see with clarity, to love without losing yourself within the other, and to live without abandoning your own essence just to fit into the space that others have reserved for you. That is the most honest definition of healing that exists. not the absence of pain, not universal approval, but the capacity to remain whole even when the world around you insists on calling your wholeness a defect. And it is exactly here at the end of this crossing that the final decision stands before you, with no possible middle ground. Because now you already know. You have already seen the invisible contracts. You have felt the weight of the mask you sustained for years. You have confronted the shadow that insisted on leaking out as resentment. You have lost entire identities built upon survival, and you have felt the fragile beginning of a freedom that still needs to be sustained day after day. The question that remains is no longer whether you are arrogant. You already know you are not. The question that remains is whether you will continue sacrificing this newly discovered clarity just to return to being acceptable in the eyes of those who prefer to see you small, or if you will accept, once and for all, the non-negotiable price of real freedom. This price is already being collected, whether you move forward or retreat. The only difference is what you receive in return. The Código do Despertar is waiting in the first pinned comment, not as a promise of comfort, but as a structure for the next 60 days of this crossing you have already begun, whether you have realized it or not. You can close this video now and go back to shrinking yourself to fit into spaces that were never made to contain who you really are. Or you can accept that the clarity you feel today is not a mistake to be corrected. It is the first real proof that you have finally stopped sleeping. The illusion is over. Choose.